Thank you for joining us today, and we're really lucky to have Sarah Backman with us from Stockholm University, who will be talking to us about her research on cyber crisis management. Sarah, as well as being a researcher, is a consultant in strategic security risk and crisis management for the consultancy Sakana in Sweden, lectures at the Swedish Defence University, and has several publications on cyber crisis management. The NTSC was pleased to participate in Sarah's research when she explored our experiences in the 2016 WannaCry incident for her paper Conceptualising Cyber Crises. Sarah has kindly agreed to showcase her findings for us at CYBERUK today, and will discuss this new area of research in academia. She'll share her method of how to conceptualise a cyber crisis and explore with us how it might be better used to understand the challenges presented and how we might better manage them. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome.
Hi everyone, I hope you all are well. Thanks for tuning into this talk today, which will be about cyber crisis management. The focus of this talk will surround how the transboundariness of cyber crisis manifests in national settings and the crisis management challenges that arise as a result. This presentation is based on my study, Conceptualizing Cyber Crisis. If you want to read it at some point, it's available open access at Journal's website. The background of the study is based in the observation that large-scale cyber crises are empirically understudied and extensively under-theorized. What I wanted to do with this study was to contribute to the understanding of cyber crisis as a phenomenon and its empirical characteristics and management challenges by suggesting that they can be conceptualized specifically as transboundary crises. This means to challenge the narrative on cyber crisis as unique events with few similarities to other types of crises. If we can understand the cyber crisis as transboundary crisis, it means that we can draw upon the literature on transboundary crisis in general and empirical lessons from other transboundary crises to understand cyber crisis. An important note is that my findings are based on a limited number of observations. Although I think that the findings are generalizable to other instances of this phenomenon, it is important to keep in mind that further studies are warranted to strengthen the findings and suggestions further. So, what is a cyber crisis? My definition of a cyber crisis derives from the definition of crisis drawn from the crisis management literature, that it involves severe turbulence, urgency in decision-making, and with critical values at stake, but with the addition that the situation is based in IT disruptions that have the potential to severely limit or eliminate the functionality of key services or critical infrastructure. Key in my definition is the disregard of reason to why it happens, so it could be caused by cyber attacks or accidents. With my definition, I'm interested in cyber crises involving publicly visible consequences, and that will activate generic crisis management structures and dynamics. An important aspect here is that our understanding of what a cyber crisis is will be influenced by our understanding of what cybersecurity is and how it should be managed. For example, if we view cybersecurity to be more about technical than strategic aspects, our cyber crisis definition will be influenced by that. This is not to say that one cyber crisis definition is necessarily superior to another, but it is important to know the underlying assumptions and leanings of one's definition. It is also important to be aware of what you exclude or choose to focus on predominantly with one's specific definition or understanding of cybersecurity in general, because it will probably influence your understanding and focus of cyber crisis too. And a note connected to this is the tendency towards describing what I would call cyber crisis as incidents or large-scale incidents, even if it activates national crisis management structures, which I think is rather puzzling. Possibly, this has something to do with the tendency to define cybersecurity and thus cyber crisis more from the red and technical perspectives rather than the blue perspectives, focused more on the causes of these cyber disruptions and the technical incident management side rather than the societal consequences and turbulence, or the crisis management dynamic that follows. So this presentation has two main aims. First, it aims to highlight crisis management challenges in each of the 7 central crisis management task domains that you see to the right. In each task domain, it will first go through what we can expect in terms of challenges based on the transboundary crisis management literature. Then I will go through findings in terms of cyber crisis management challenges in each task domain. Finally, the presentation will provide some suggestions derived from the findings of my study in terms of what might be needed to manage cyber crisis efficiently as transboundary crisis managed in national settings. So beyond establishing the cyber crisis definition, it is also important to know the transboundary crisis definition for this presentation. Pointing to the rise of transboundary threats to societal security and the interdependence between critical systems of modern societies, crisis management scholars have increasingly put efforts into understanding the transboundary crisis as a specific type of crisis. The same rising interest for transboundary issues can be noted in the closely related disaster management literature, as the number of disasters that have transboundary consequences appears to be on the rise. So, what sets the transboundary crisis apart from the traditional crisis is, simply put, its tendency to not be limited by geographical, political, sectoral, economic, social, or legal boundaries. More specifically, a transboundary crisis may be defined as a crisis which transcends first political boundaries, such as geographical borders, jurisdictions, or levels of governance. Secondly, functional boundaries, such as sectoral, policy, and industry domains. And finally, time boundaries. A key theme in the body of literature on transboundary crisis has been the identification of the additional complexity of strategic management of transboundary crisis compared to confined crisis. And I will go through some of those in this presentation. So the study applies an analytical framework which outlines the tasks of detection, sense-making, decision-making, coordination, meaning-making, communication, and crisis ending termination as key crisis management task domains. The first one, detection, surrounds the task of discovering an unfolding or emerging crisis event and the collection of data connected to it, while sense-making refers to the task of collecting, processing, and sharing information and situational pictures, and achieve a common understanding about what's going on. Decision-making is about crisis leadership, ownership, and making and implementation of crisis decisions. Coordination refers to the task of coordinating actions and actors involved in the crisis management efforts. The task of meaning-making and communication concerns the task of formulating a comprehensive account of what's going on and distribute it successfully to affected audiences, involved actors, and stakeholders. The task of termination refers to deciding when the crisis is over and when the crisis resources and measures can be withdrawn. And an important note here is that these should not be viewed as a total linear crisis management process, since the tasks between detection and crisis ending is rather cyclical until the crisis is over. So the first central crisis management task domain is detection. Detection is a complex task which becomes even more difficult in transboundary crisis. First, this has to do with societal vulnerability, dependency, and interdependency. The idea that technology and modernization will eventually create societal risks and accidents is not a new one. During the early 1990s, the idea of the so-called risk society, introduced by sociologists Beck and Giddens, became increasingly popular, referring to the idea that hazards and insecurities will be systemically produced and induced by modernization itself. In the risk society, the unintended and unknown consequences will be prevalent. As the technical options grow, Beck argued, so will the incalculability of their consequences. In 1984, Charles Perrow argued that accidents are to be expected in systems that are complex and tightly coupled. His argument was that structural characteristics of tight coupling and interactive complexity could undermine even the most determined efforts to prevent accidents, which makes accidents normal. Efforts to increase safety will only add to the complexity and thus make it more prone to accidents. Perrow mainly developed his idea with relatively limited systems in mind. However, it can be argued that the problem posed by the combination of complexity, entanglement, and tight coupling is essential when it comes to understanding the context, conditions, and characteristics of cybercrisis and cybersecurity problems on a wider scale today as well. The combination of the risk society and the complex and entangled systems creates a situation where systems can gradually develop crisis potential without anyone perceiving it clearly. The signals leading up to the crisis can be very difficult to detect due to it consisting of a combination of vulnerabilities and threats, which are sometimes distributed and not clearly connected. Add the conditions of the risk society described by Beck, and this creates the possibility for a quick escalation and distribution of consequences across functional and political sphere when the crisis hits. So, what detection challenges arises in cybercrisis then? First, we can talk about the ideas of the risk society and normal accidents applied to the field of cybersecurity. Regarding the risk society, this has a pretty obvious application in the digital dependencies we have created through the fast-paced digitalization of society. As individuals and society, we now rely on digital services for almost every aspect of our lives and societal functionalities, including communication, banking services, ID authentication, transportation, and health management. Sectors of critical infrastructure, including energy, food distribution, financial services, and telecommunication, are increasingly connected and interconnected. Regarding the idea of normal accidents, this can arguably be applied on several levels. On the technical level, the dynamic of complexity, entanglement, and tight coupling is manifested in the layers of legacy code and/or legacy hardware in the foundation of ICS of critical infrastructure. Some of these layers may be written in outdated code languages, which means that a relatively small number of people understand it. When the layers of different code languages are placed on top of each other, the number of people who can understand the whole system is continuously diminished, adding the complexity component. The tight coupling component is added through the dependency of each code layer to the next, creating the possibility for disturbances to spread quickly through the system and onwards to coupled systems. But this dynamic is also prevalent on higher levels of abstraction. Driven by the speed of innovation and the need for efficiency, large-scale structures of modern critical infrastructure are highly connected and interconnected over large geographical regions. Many of these services are privately owned and managed by international companies, stretching across several countries and jurisdictions, making them difficult to govern. Moreover, they are usually dependent on a vast number of supply chain actors and services. So complexity on this level thus manifests in the difficulty to get an overview of vulnerabilities in its complex ecology of systems, structures, and actors. Digital attack surfaces on critical infrastructure are vast, and an antagonist actor only needs to find one vulnerability to exploit, technical or human, in the actual service or in the supply chain to the service, which means that attackers are always in advantage of defenders. Through centralization and interdependence of systems and supply chain actors, critical infrastructure sectors are also to an increasing extent entangled and tightly coupled. And this leads to a situation where it can be difficult to detect and mitigate the main cause of a cyber crisis, and where the consequences might spread quickly and extensively. This in turn creates crisis management challenges such as managing a great amount of affected actors to analyze and detangle vast amounts of technical and non-technical information. It puts pressure on surge capacity of technically skilled incident managers, as well as scaling procedures of crisis management structures. Moreover, it creates the need for private-public and interagency coordination in ways that might not have formal or pre-established paths and procedures. So sensemaking is perhaps one of the most complex concepts of the 7 crisis management tasks, both empirically and theoretically. Definitions and framings of the concept of sensemaking in crisis vary, but a common definition refers to sensemaking as the task of collecting, systemically analyzing, and distributing critical information, which helps to generate a shared situational picture. Another definition refers to sensemaking as the process through which people work to understand issues that are novel, ambiguous, or violate expectations. Earlier research has highlighted the influence of cognitive factors of individuals, group dynamics, organizational norms, and political construction in the sensemaking process. Common for these perspectives is the emphasis on the sense-making process as a social process and the social construction of a common understanding rather than it being a process of rationality. For example, Weick emphasized sense-making as the interplay of action and interpretation rather than the influence of evaluation on choice. He also argued that sense-making plays a central role in determining human behavior, because it is in the sense-making process where meanings materialize that directs identity and then action. What we can take from this is that the sense-making process is a complex one, which will end up reflecting the subjective worldview of the sense-making actor. In a transboundary crisis with many involved organizations and with a complex crisis at hand, this will result in many different sense-making processes with different outcomes. It will be a challenge to get a common situational picture across organizations. And I think the COVID-19 crisis is a rather good example of this. In a cyber crisis, a common operating picture must be created and distributed to many actors from information that is often incomplete, contradictory, and continuously changing. Several interviewees of my study highlighted the difficulty to manage information surrounding the cyber crisis, to make sense of it, and to reach a common interorganizational understanding of the situation. As a complex type of crisis, the situational understanding of a cyber crisis might be diffused by faulty or competing accounts from other organizations and/or media. In both cases I studied, the lack of confinement of the crisis and the amount of partly highly technical information and data to analyze and detangle added to the difficulty to collect and process crisis-related information. And not just anyone can do this. As one of the interviewees told me, information was pouring in and we were too few to manage or sort it properly. It was difficult to distinguish important from non-important information, new from old. Moreover, several interviewees told me that the crisis management efforts might entail lots of stress on a few individuals in national cybersecurity structures who are key for several important tasks in connection to information management. Okay, so decision making. When a crisis falls within a delineated authority space, at least it's clear who or which venue should be making the decisions. Transboundary crises, on the other hand, are typically accompanied by a dispersion of authority. As the transboundary crises touch multiple actors with different responsibilities, it might not be entirely clear who should lead the response efforts. The more actors are involved, the less likelihood that someone takes charge. There are no ready-made solutions for managing transboundary crises, and yet transboundary crisis requires swift action. In a rapidly changing situation, when a situational picture to base decisions on is created, it may already be outdated. So, highlighted decision-making challenges in my study included first the fact that there might be a quite vague or a very complex situational picture or report to base decisions on as a result of a challenging sense-making process and a very complex problem. So technical aspects can make it difficult for decision makers to understand the crisis well enough to make informed decisions. The second challenge was the dispersion of authority as a result of the transboundariness of the crisis. This included overlaps in some places and gaps in others in terms of crisis ownerships and areas of responsibility. As one of my interviewees told me, usually in crisis management, it is quite easy to see who owns the crisis. In cyber crisis, on the other hand, it can be quite difficult. This will result in a situation where many are involved and interfaces becomes an issue. A lack of clear ownership and pre-established authority relations will lead to crisis management efforts that are characterized by informal connections, improvisation, and a decentralized approach. So, coordination is a challenging crisis management task in any crisis. However, the challenges connected to this task tend to be amplified by the independent linkages between involved actors in a transboundary crisis. As the graph shows, when the societal consequences and turbulence rises, so does the involved actors, both on the victim side and on the crisis management side. And simultaneously, stress in decision-making rises due to uncertainty, urgency, and the critical values being at stake. And usually media coverage and pressure from that usually follows too. And this makes for a difficult situation in terms of the task of coordination. Crisis management systems of states were simply not built with transboundary crisis in mind, and the traditional organizational policy and legal tools might not be effective in response to them. Moreover, modern technological developments may support transboundary crisis response, but they might also add complexity or vulnerability to the already complex response settings. Coordination is perhaps even more difficult in cyber crisis than in other transboundary crises due to the technical aspects of the crisis management efforts. On a vertical level, the technical, operational, and strategic level of the response must be somewhat connected and coordinated to be effective. On the horizontal level, we have coordination requirements within and between affected sectors, between private actors and public actors involved, and between agencies and government actors. Meanwhile, there might not be anyone with an overarching authority who can facilitate coordination on this level. Moreover, there are several tracks of the cyber crisis management efforts, working simultaneously but with different timelines, goals, expertise, and challenges. And this adds to the difficulty of fully grasping and coordinating the crisis management efforts. To take an example of how there are different crisis management tracks in a cyber crisis, I like to take the analogy of a traffic accident. So a large car crash happens, involving several cars with many injured people. Soon you will have various actors involved with different expertise and goals at the scene. The most urgent and most important task is, of course, to save lives and to prevent more people from getting hurt. An ambulance is called to the scene to tend to the injured, and that is prioritized. Meanwhile, traffic is redirected by the police to prevent more accidents from happening. The scene might be shut down for investigation into the cause of the accident. If the accident was someone's fault, there will be a criminal investigation and perhaps a trial in the aftermath. And even if it's not a perfect analogy, I think it illustrates the point that there are several different tracks in the crisis management efforts, and they have different timelines and challenges and involved areas of expertise. In a crisis, political leaders are expected to reduce uncertainty and provide an authoritative account of what's going on, why it's happening, and what needs to be done. When a crisis involves an increasing number of political, administrative, and sectoral authorities, it becomes harder to produce one clear and coherent message that relieves collective stress and provides people with actionable advice. The many involved actors and the complex features of transboundary crisis creates conditions for multiple accounts on a given situation. Thus, the transboundary crisis may be subjected to framing contests. Cybercrisis communication was highlighted by almost all of my 10 interviewees as one of the most challenging crisis management tasks. The many involved actors and the complex nature of cybercrisis create conditions for multiple different accounts. Managing competing narratives, disinformation, or faulty accounts can be very difficult and strain crisis management resources. As one of the Estonian interviewers told me, it is easy to build a doomsday scenario around the event of 2007 and the cyber incidents in general. A lot of the later coverage on it was a bit exaggerated. The sense of panic that is often depicted by foreign coverage of the crisis does not match the experience of those who were actually there. A Swedish interviewee said, "Cyber crises are good examples of media-driven crises. Our experience is that it is easy for the media and the general public to draw faulty conclusions in connection to cyber incidents and perhaps make them worse because the knowledge on how cyber incidents and attacks work is rather low." Several interviews emphasized the challenge in producing one clear and coherent message that relieves collective stress. This also includes translating complex technical information to easily understandable crisis communication. As one of the UK interviewers explained, one of the biggest challenges was communication. Getting the right communication out at the right time, providing guidance in order to keep people from jumping to conclusions. Another UK interviewee echoed this and highlighting the challenge in getting control of the information surrounding a cyber crisis, to be able to put together a message of what has happened and then communicate it to decision makers and the public. So the findings of my study suggest that cyber crises tend to involve hazy time boundaries. The challenge of termination in cyber crisis as a result of this was brought up by several interviewees. It is never easy to determine whether a cyber crisis is really over or just resting, one interviewee explained. Another mentioned that many of the visible cyber crises we have seen follows a dynamic where they start off intensely, requiring quick and intense work efforts, especially on the technical side. Then they might turn into a more slow-burning, low-intensity crisis which does not have a clear ending point. It can be difficult to know to what extent the vulnerability is still present, as well as the extent of the breach, due to lack of reporting, etc., and therefore whether and to what extent services could be disrupted again. Accountability and the possibility for legal action against attackers can be delayed and or hindered by the difficulty of attribution in cyberspace. Moreover, technical analysis, mitigation, and accountability processes are long-term and resource-heavy activities involving many stakeholders. Further studies are warranted to explore the findings of this study further, including studies focused on what kind of response systems are needed to best deal with the challenges outlined in this presentation. However, some preliminary suggestions derived from the findings of my study can be inferred in terms of what might be needed to manage cyber crisis efficiently. So the first one is the ability to quickly mobilize and deploy technical expertise. The crisis included in this study, supported by interview data, suggests that cyber crises have the potential to be highly complex and long-running, possibly in combination with prolonged intensity. Combined with their management demands in terms of technical expertise and their tendency to involve consequences which are distributed across both political and functional boundaries, long-running cyber crisis may put substantial strain on the available cyber crisis management assets of national administrations. A key capacity of national administrations' cyber crisis management arrangement is therefore the ability to mobilize and involve support in terms of responders with the proper skills, which is rather challenging due to the current cyber skills shortage. So the second one is creativity, improvisation, and pragmatic thinking in situations where there are really no pre-established procedures or structures. In both cases of my study, the responder's capability to use creativity, adaptability, improvisation, and pragmatic thinking in the response, despite complexity and/or a lack of preparation, kept the situation from getting much worse. Pre-established ways of classifying incidents, including plans and procedures, and pre-identify areas of responsibilities are very important, but they must be paired with a capacity for dynamic change and adaptability. Formal cyber crisis management structures should be built to allow for such creativity and pragmatic thinking, since cyber crises may take unexpected turns and require cooperation between actors who are not really used to working together. So the third one is having pre-established formal and informal relationships across political and functional borders. When it comes to information sharing structures or relationships, very little can be invented in the midst of the turmoil of crisis. The lines of communication and the trusted relationships must already be established to make it possible to draw upon them efficiently during crisis. One of the success factors in the response of these crises was the already established informal and trusted relationships with partners across government, in the private sector, and with international partners like CERTs and other cyber expert and incident managers. These relationships also allowed for creative and agile responses despite novel and complex situations. To achieve this, interviewees highlighted the importance of trust-building measures. The fourth one is quickly transferring correct advice to the public and controlling the narrative. Delivering advice on cybersecurity issues can be challenging if the audience knowledge on cybersecurity and technical issues is low. Due to the complexity surrounding cyber crisis in terms of vulnerabilities, consequences, and attribution, the official narrative might be surrounded by multiple other accounts and narratives, including disinformation, which might be difficult to counter. However, interviewees mentioned controlling the narrative and quickly transferring correct advice to the public as among the most important aspects of effective cyber crisis management. And finally, bridge building capacities. Inherent in cyber crisis is that they are never just cyber problems. While large-scale cyber incident management might once have been about IT technical matters, it is now a question of collaboration across political and functional spheres about collaborative crisis management. As one interviewee emphasized, cyber crisis management is a team sport. The capacity to bridge between, for example, a number of different agencies, between government and antivirus companies, between technical incident managers and decision makers, or the capacity to translate technical information to easily understandable public advice may require specially prepared and trained staff within the cyber crisis management structures. So to conclude this presentation, these are some recommendations from the literature on transboundary crisis management on important crisis management mechanisms to manage transboundary crises, and my suggestions on what they can mean for cyber crisis management. So the first one is distributed sensemaking, to have a capacity to make sense together across the various organizations involved. And for a cyber crisis, that could mean mechanisms for joint sense-making efforts. And that could be both on the horizontal level and the vertical level. Networked coordination, and that could mean mechanisms for crisis management coordination. Here too, both on the horizontal level and the vertical level. And the third one is surge capacity, which could mean the ability to mobilize expertise and cyber incident managers. And finally, formal scaling procedures, which could mean the ability to adapt and efficiently respond to a quickly escalating cyber crisis. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. And if you want to read the whole study, you can search for Conceptualizing Cyber Crisis at the journal's website, and it will come up and be open. So thank you so much.